Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Steven now, and first off, this is October 31st, Halloween, and I thought, well, I want to do a video to commemorate this day, so I decided to do my top 10 favorite slasher movies. Now, this was a really hard list for me to do, because first off, I had to double check what counts as a slasher, as some films I had on the list, I found out weren't really qualified for slashers. They could qualify for horror movies, which I would do probably next year for next Halloween. But I found out that, they qualify for horror, but not for slashers. Now, for those of you who aren't really understand what a slasher film is, well, let me give you a rundown. A slasher film is essentially about, usually revolves around the idea of this crazy killer going around killing people in creative ways. Mostly teens are usually the prime suspect. The prime group of people getting killed. Other things that are usually involved in a slasher include, we have some nudity, sex scenes. It can be a bit sleazy, a bit cheesy, a little bit, I guess, and they were usually filmed on very low budgets. But for some of these films have become pop culture icons, launching their killers to essentially be what draws people into the film. Anyway, that's the definition of a slasher, because it's really, for me, even though I know what a slasher film is, I can also just get too confusing myself to explaining what a slasher is. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into the top 10. There are no honorable mentions for this list this time around, but and that's just because for me, it's really, I really had to go through and see what I consider to really be a top 10. Besides, I just don't feel like doing an honorable mention for this list. Who knows? Maybe next time. Number 10, Slumber Party Massacre. What makes this film for me so unique in slasher film history is that first off, this is the first, I think, horror film to be directed by a woman, and it's mostly a dominant female cast. Basically, the premise of this is, on the night of these girls having a slumber party, there's a crazed serial killer on the loose who uses this famous, I guess jacksaw, I guess you could say, as his weapon of choice, goes around killing. I like this because of the novelty. It is an all-female cast. Majority of it is a female cast, and these women are shown to be independent, strong, fierce women, which is very not what you see in a slasher, because they're usually portrayed as the damsel in distress or majority to get killed, the women to get killed. I like it for that fact. And I just like it for the novelty that it's mostly an all-female film. There are some guys in it, of course. The main killer is a guy, but I just like the novelty of it. And for me, it's just a mindless filler entertainment. And that's what I like about it so much. Number 9, My Bloody Valentine. Oh, what can I say about this film? After a certain film that came out in '78, which launched the slasher craze and essentially these films started coming out left and right in the '80s, with the Slumber Party Massacre being one, and its two sequels that followed. My Bloody Valentine for me is just a unique film in its own right. Set on Valentine's Day, just like the thing intended, this film is basically, on Valentine's Day, a serial killer goes around killing people. But what makes it different is, first off, it's set in Canada, and it's in a mining town, which I find just to be a breath of fresh air, and there's this love triangle. And the reason I love it so much is because the love triangle for this film doesn't feel too cheesy or eye-rolling. It feels natural, and it serves to drive the film. I also gotta admit, I love the serial killer, how he's dressed in that mining gear. It just looks great. It looks intimidating. Now, this film did get a remake in the 2000s when slasher films were getting remade left and right, and but that film is not as good, but this one is. It is good, and the kills are spectacular. But however, you gotta understand, there are two versions. There is the rated version, and there is the unrated version. And last time I checked, and from what I've definitely seen, the unrated version is where, like, these more creative kills are. So you gotta be careful which one you see. For me, this film is just really great. It's really great. I love the ending, which was possibly to set up for a possible sequel, but it never happened. This film has gained a cult following in its own right, which explains its sequel status. For me, this is just a really great film, and the characters, the backstory is really great, and it's just a really... whilst the number 10 spot is just a mindless slasher with a novelty driving it, this one is a really good, well-crafted movie for me. Well-crafted slasher. Number 8. Sleepaway Camp. Okay, this one is definitely a huge cult following in the slasher genre. Okay, killings basically after basically this young girl Angela goes to a summer camp for the summer, and whilst there, she is essentially, hanging out with a bunch of kids, and whilst that's happening, a bunch of murders start happening. You think about it, murders at a summer camp is nothing new to the genre. That's been done before. That's been done, and is almost a stereotype. What I like about this film is this filming is a bit awkward, which draws me into it. Which feels and the reason why, because it feels like the director was almost like a passion piece. I also like it for once in a slasher film, these kids are kids, and I buy them being kids. I buy them being teens. They would say stuff like this, and it doesn't feel awkward. Also, it's famous for its twist ending. But beyond that, this film is just great. It really feels like teens like this would happen, and other than the shock ending, it's really great, and it would spawn sequels with the next two being followed, and were filmed roughly around the same time, and then of course there'll be a fourth one in the early 2000s, I believe. For me, the first one is definitely the far superior ones, with 2 and 3 not being so good, and 4 okay, but at the same time it has something holding it back. For me, this is definitely it just feels different, and for me, that's what makes films like this work. You have to make them feel different. And let's get to number 7, which is Silent Night, Deadly Night. Now, I might get a bit of flack because I'm not sure if you would call this a slasher, but for me, people do get killed by a psycho killer, and some kids get killed as well. So for me, that counts as a slasher. Now, in this film, we follow the story of a kid named Billy, who, after suffering a post-traumatic stress from the killing of his parents, who were murdered on Christmas Eve by a guy dressed as Santa Claus, he is then sent to the orphan's home, where he's still suffering from post-traumatic stress all the way to adulthood. Essentially, he didn't get the medical treatment he got, but eventually it just kept getting worse for him until he eventually snaps and becomes the serial killer dressed as Santa Claus, going around killing naughty people, naughty kids, essentially. Now, what I like about this slasher is we spent the majority of the first film setting up this character, and other than most killers will probably just snap in one day, what makes Billy so great is that he eventually snaps after a period of time, because he didn't get the treatment he needed, didn't get help, and this is what happened to him. Ironically, this slasher caused a lot of controversy by its release because of the idea of a killer Santa Claus. But the thing is, it's not Santa Claus going around killing people. It is a guy dressed up as Santa Claus going around killing people. Well, like my Bloody Valentines, it uses a special holiday as its title. And for me, I just like the fact we get to spend the majority of the movie getting to know this character before he snaps is really cool. Now, there are some sequels, but the second one having a famous meme, Garbage Day, as really why the second one is basically famous, but the sequels that followed were trash. However, the remake, I gotta admit, I actually enjoyed. And for me, I think it's a remake that it acknowledges the series past, but it does something different at the same time. But it doesn't fully work, but the remake, reboot, is definitely entertaining. This one, but however, this film is definitely the far superior. I like how we get to spend where we develop to be sympathetic for our killer. And it's not like the guy is really evil. True, he does kill some innocent people, but he does go and kill some people who arguably deserve it. So, I can't really say that he's a fully cold-hearted killer, but I like just how this film... Anyway, this slasher, we get to actually understand the killer, and that's what I really like about it. Number 6. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Okay, I'm about to get some flack here. Okay, let's just give a brief history. Friday the 13th is one of the most iconic horror franchises out there. It's up there in the top 4 horror franchises, which I will say at least one film from each franchise is at least on this list. For me, Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is essentially the 4th film in the series, and it's a weird calling it that, but to be fair, the franchise was to end after this film, but because it was so successful, it spawned a few sequels. Now, there are a lot of good films in the franchise. The first one is average. 2 and 3 build on each other until we get to the 4th one. 5 is bad. 6 is, for many people, their favorites. But the films that followed after that were pretty terrible. And there was a remake, which I actually liked. I actually liked the remake. But I decided out of all the Friday the 13th, I decided to choose the 4th one, the final chapter, because in many ways it does set out what it sets to do. Basically, in this one, Jason Voorhees, the killer of the Friday the 13th franchise, comes out of essentially, I guess you could say, coma after an incident that happened in the previous film, comes out and slowly finds his way back to Camp Crystal Lake, where these new teens have come to the camp to party. But across from them, there is a family there with a kid who is named Tommy Jarvis. Across the family that lives across the kid Jarvis. Tommy Jarvis is essentially the sort of hero of the film. Is living across just as Jason gets back and starts his killing spree again. I like this film because it does set out what it's set to do. By this point, the formula had fully come together. By the 4th one, Jason finally has his iconic hockey mask, which he didn't get until his 3rd film. Hell, Jason wasn't even the first villain of the first Friday the 13th. It was actually his mother, and he didn't become the main villain, or at least the main focus villain of the franchise until the 2nd film. Other than that, this film sets out what it sets to do. There's a bunch of sleazy teens coming to spend a weekend, or spend a time at a campgrounds, essentially, but there's a family living across, and Tommy Jarvis is a unique character. First off, you actually have a kid as the main hero, and he's a very interesting character. The same with Crispin Glover's character, Jimmy Mortimer. I think that's how his last name's pronounced. Sorry, voice is a bit bad. And essentially Jason goes around doing so great kills. But for me, I consider it the best of the Friday the 13th. It set out what it's set to do. Jason killing teens at a campground. But Tommy Jarvis, for me, elevates as a really good supporting character, and the character will essentially be a recurring character in the 2 films that follow this. And it was called the final chapter because, spoiler alert, Jason dies at the end. But of course, thanks to the 6th film of the franchise, he gets resurrected. Basically, for me, this is just, for me, the ultimate Friday the 13th experience. It set out what it's set to do, and if the franchise did end after this film, this would have been a good way to end the franchise. But of course, because they made money, they needed to keep doing the films. But overall, for me, this just feels like a good Friday the 13th film. Anyway, number 5, Black Christmas. Though the slasher films become to dominate the 80s, there were a few films that tried to do slashers way before. Hell, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho has a lot of elements that would inspire slashers, and in 1974, 2 films would come to be arguably 2 of the first slashers. Black Christmas is one of them. In this film, a psycho killer named Billy comes to a sorority house and starts killing all the females in there. Now, I like this film because we don't fully know who the killer is. We never see him. I also love it because there's so much drama woven into the plot, and it doesn't feel like it's, like it's dragging. Black Christmas is also known for introducing not just some of the stereotypes that you expect as slashers, such as the killer is in the house line, but other than that with the stereotypes, for me, this is a really well-crafted story, and should be remembered as probably one of the first ever slashers. Now, understand, this film came out in the early 70s, and slashers wouldn't become dominant until the 80s. And although this is one of the arguably first slashers, I wouldn't call it to be the first slasher. I would like to give that honor to a different film on the list, but we'll get to that as soon as we meet him. Anyway, number 4, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise is absolutely unique in slasher genres. Not only does it have a unique killer going after teens, but the method is different. You see, up until this point, majority of slashers were always people wearing usually a motif, like they either had some kind of look, some kind of suit, and usually wield some kind of either axe, knife, or something of that nature to go and kill their victims. Well, we get that kind of with Freddy Krueger with his finger knives. But what makes him unique is he doesn't kill them while they're in the real world. You see, he kills his victims in his sleep. And because of that, Wes Craven introduced one of the unique slashers of the genre. Now, there are loads of Nightmare on Elm Street films, and I was tempted to give it to the third one, The Dream Warriors, or even Wes Craven's New Nightmare. But I decided to give it to the first one. For me, the first one is just unique, and it was clear that the film was only meant to be just one film. It wasn't meant to be a series, but because it was hugely successful, they needed to draw it out until the point they just got bad. I also got to admit, seeing Freddy Krueger by Robert Englund is very different here. You see, in the later films, it would get cartoony, a little bit silly, but still threatening. Here, he just plays it straight, but I just like the performance here. Again, what makes these slashers are their killers. And for me, he is absolutely creative in the way he kills. Interesting fact, Johnny Depp here plays a small role in this, which is really great. For me, the idea of a killer killing you in your sleep is absolutely disturbing, but surprisingly really interesting, as arguably Freddy Krueger is arguably the most creative killer in all of horror. And I just love this film. I love the ending, even though the ending's kind of divided. People hate it or you love it. I personally love it. Even true, some of the effects can be a little bit cheap or weird or not as good. But understand, this was a slasher film made in the 80s. But for me, this film is so well choreographed. It's got great dialogue. Wes Craven really created an iconic slasher film. Number 3. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This is arguably, I consider, the proper first slasher film. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is arguably one of the most unique in the series for me. It has a very sympathetic killer who was forced to be a part of this weird family, and the And basically, we follow about this group of teens who go out into the, I guess the South, until they stumble across this old house where they meet this family of cannibalistic killers, including its most popular member, Leatherface. I like this film for its cinematography because it goes for a sort of documentary feel, which makes sense because the film kind of says it tries to go off as something that's happened in real life. And to be fair, the film was based on actual real life events. It was based off an actual serial killer that wasn't a cannibalist. He did kill people and use their carcasses to create these weird objects. So yeah, so there is a lot of that. I like the cinematography. I absolutely love the kills here. Now, there is no real blood or gore. Again, these were early slashers. Those wouldn't come into really the 80s. In the early slashers, the majority of kills were more implied and were used to great effect here. And I like how the family here really, puts these characters into a psychological position. Like putting them in these situations and psychologically put them through this experience. I like the ending here, and I like Leatherface, how he does this weird sort of, I guess, dance. And for me, Leatherface is just a unique killer on the same level as Freddy Krueger. For me, I find out of all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies, the first one is the best. The second one is great in its own right, but for me, I always found the first one to be the far superior one. And number 2, let's look at the slasher that kicked off the craze. 1978's Halloween. This one kicked everything off. John Carpenter and everyone here came together to create one of the most memorable slashers in all of cinema. In this film, a psycho killer by the name of Michael Myers escaped a mental institution, and once he's finally got his hands on his iconic looking mask and a jumpsuit, and of course grabs his knife, goes to a nearby town and goes on a killing spree. I like how just like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, there is no real gore, but the kills here are very creative and very dark. I like how the killer comes to this place that really has no real, I guess you could say, like, evil. You see, in other films, the majority of the time, the characters go to the place where there's all this evil. And Halloween was one of the few films where, for the first time, the killer comes to the place. I really like that. Michael Myers has a unique design, and of course, I also love how has this nickname that he has, Dr. Lupus, portrayed by Donald Pleasance, who of course we know played Blofeld and He Only Lived Twice, gives a memorable performance here as basically the guy who's trying to hunt Michael Myers. A lot of things were introduced in this film. The idea that you can never have sex, as once you do, you get killed. And the final girl with the main female character always defending herself against the crazed killer. And I just love the ending. It's so ominous. And the soundtrack is just absolutely there. It's absolutely great. I love this film for its simplicity. It was one of the most commercially and is the most famous independent film to be commercially successful and kicked off the slasher craze throughout the 80s. And to be honest, I was content to put this film at the number 1 spot, but I found just one film just edged it out a bit. So ladies and gentlemen, my number 1 favorite slasher film is Scream. You see, like I said, slashers were dominantly huge in the 80s, but by the 90s, the craze was nearly dying out. Scream revolutionized and essentially revitalized the genre. In Scream, we are in the film where every character knows the rules of the genre. They know the 3 rules to survive a horror film. You can't have sex, you can't do drugs or get drunk, and never ever say, "I'll be right back." Not only are we set in the real world where characters know the rules, but it's also done realistically as a crazed killer's going around. Everyone knows the rules of the genre and the way to survive a film, but because they know the rules doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win. We also have one of the most, for me, a really good twist on my first viewing I never saw coming. And I just love how this film, though it is self-aware, it is set in reality, but at the same time the kills are just as gory. And I was just blown away that a film that it has a bit of comedic value, but at the same time it is real. It is there. And that's what I like about it. It's self-aware. But at the same time, it's willing to be scary. It's willing to really just make you on the edge of your seats to ask yourselves why. Why and who's going to win. It knows the rules of the genre, and the later films kind of plagued it a bit. With the second one being, in my opinion, pretty good. The third one, terrible. The fourth one, okay. And the TV show, for me, actually quite enjoyable to a degree. But for me, it all started here. This rejuvenated the genre and really put more focus on the teens. There are lots of references to previous horrors, which I really love. And for me, this film is just a way to really kick boost the genre back into its glory that it absolutely deserves. And that's why Scream is my number 1. And there we have it, my top 10 slasher films. Now, what are your favorites? Which one are your favorites? Would you have done the list differently? What is your number 1 favorite slasher film? Write me down in the comments, and this has been the Steven Hour. So long for now.